Right, so everybody in the room, welcome to the Centre for Arts and Learning for our last All for the Arts event this year. And we're delighted to have with us professors of international arts education and visual cultures, Raphael Vella and Andrea Kárpáti and Tavin. And this is, as I said, the last event, CAL event for All for the Arts this year, although we do have another conference coming up. We brought many issues to the fore for inclusivity in the arts and learning into discussion this year. All our CAL events are recorded. If you go to our CAL recordings page, and they're cultural texts for audiences, for different stakeholders, for students, for policymakers, researchers to come in and listen to what's happened before. So if you couldn't make the talk today, no worries, you can listen to our recorded videos and feedback on those to me, if you like, as head of Centre for Arts and Learning. The only thing you won't be able to do is ask questions of our wonderful panel. So Raphael Vella is a professor of art education at the Faculty of Education, University of Malta. He coordinates postgraduate degrees in art education and social practice arts and critical education. Raphael is involved in research projects related to sustainability and art, the impact of socially engaged arts and arts education in Malta and internationally. His recent publications include Artists, Teachers in Context, International Dialogues, Art Ethics Education, and Documents of Socially Engaged Art. Andrea Kárpáti is professor at the Institute of Marketing and Communication Science, Corvinus University, Budapest, and head of the CUB Visual Culture Research Group that has completed 7 international projects on the development and assessment of visuospatial skills, media literacy of children and youth, and visual communication of youth subcultures. Her recent work includes Horizon 2020 EMAS, Acting on the Margins, Arts as Social Culture. Tavin is Professor of International Arts Education and former Head of Department of Art at Aalto University, Helsinki, Finland. His research focuses on visual culture, critical pedagogy, cultural studies, psychoanalytic theory, and post-digital, post-internet art and education. Recent books include Post-Digital, Post-Internet Art and Education, Art, Access and Education, Historical and Discursive Context, and Angels, Ghosts and Cannibals, Essays on Art Education and Visual Culture. So that's our illustrious and eminent professors that we have with us today. And I'm going to hand over to Kevin now. So Kevin, you can take up the floor and show your slides and introduce our first question for the panel.
Okay, thank you again, Miranda, for putting this all together and bringing us together. I'm so pleased to be with such prominent art educators and friends, and pleased that we have a great audience here. I'm not going to take very long, but I'm going to share my screen. If I can do this correctly, this is always a problem. No, that's a whiteboard. I apologize. Okay. Yes, please give me 1 minute. I've done this a million times, but it unfortunately difficult. Okay, so I'll share a portion of my screen if you allow me to move this. And I often talk to myself when I share the screen, so I hope that's okay with everybody. Okay. Can you see that, everyone? The slide? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with the question, which is, what are some of the differences and similarities between art education for social justice, which is a very big and broad umbrella in the United States in particular, and socially engaged art across Europe and the US? So really, what are some of the differences and similarities? And I want to start with this question because my wife and I were very interested in this, having both worked in Europe and the United States, and how people are using these terms interchangeably or what they mean. And so we did a research project. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I would just like to say a few things about this. We interviewed 4 people prominent art educators, though there are many, so I apologize for those that are prominent and are here or that we didn't have a chance to interview. This is just the emergent and beginning of the research. And we asked them their questions about the relationship between social justice and socially engaged art. And these are some of the questions we asked in the beginning. When and for what reasons have questions of social justice, if they have, become important in art education in Europe? It's a very big question, but also we're talking locally within the area that the art educators are working. What kinds of forms have these practices taken? So what have you taken or your students taken up? And then what different ways have social oppression been acknowledged by art educators in different European countries, and how have art educators reacted upon them? And the broader research questions, and then I'm not really going to go into the deep research. We started with what is the framework of European art educators to understand social justice, because we didn't want there to be, a monolithic or only one kind of way of understanding social justice, especially coming from an either Anglo-American or American perspective, colonial perspective of, ironically, what social justice means, how is it practiced, and when and for what reasons specific questions of social justice become important. So we interviewed 4, as I said, art educators. One wanted to remain anonymous. We had many questions and many answers, but I think I'll jump to the conclusions for now. So as I said, the research is in its early stages. It's emergent. A lot of the comments came up around curricula and what type of curricula is taught, and very specific types of oppression that happen and social injustices within particular countries. And then I think what was most important is how the term justice is understood differently than social justice, whether it's about what students are chosen to join in a particular program, about gender equality, about political oppression. And I think that the point of this, and I'll end with this, is that coming from the US and having spent most of my life teaching in the US, although I spent a long time in Finland, it is a very big issue in the United States, and we wanted to really broaden this concept so it doesn't, become kind of colonizing for what social justice is, to take over, people that are doing different kinds of socially engaged art. So that's the research, and the question is, what are some of the differences between social justice and socially engaged art? So I will stop sharing, and that's it. Thanks.
Right. So thank you for introducing the question, Kevin. And this is open to our panel to answer. So the questions for the audience or from the audience will come at the end of this discussion. So who from our panel would like to first of all respond to Kevin's question?
Yeah, Miranda, I can perhaps also try to reply to this question. I think, art education for social justice and socially engaged art have kind of similar goals, that they, try to give a voice to individuals and communities through artistic action, and they promote inclusivity, they challenge systemic inequalities. They also try to achieve some kind of tangible change through art. They use sometimes, I would say, also similar strategies in that they, for example, facilitate dialogue. Dialogue seems to be a big thing in socially engaged art, also in art education for social justice, and this is obviously taking inspiration from the work of Paulo Freire. Unlike Paulo Freire, they tend to value the importance of also moving beyond dialogue. So dialogue is insufficient in itself as a kind of action, but it needs to lead to some kind of more concrete process. very often the process which is used tends to be collaborative, and the process itself sometimes becomes the artistic medium. So it's not really about creating art only for some kind of outcome, some kind of artistic product, but also, you know, the actual process of bringing people together is, I think, an important aspect for both of them. At the same time, I would say there are also some important differences in that, for example, they use different persons and also contexts to achieve the same goals. So, for example, with art education for social justice, understandably, teachers are the persons who would normally implement that in educational settings. While with socially engaged art, it would be implemented, generally speaking, by, you know, artists in non-institutional settings. You know, they aren't necessarily implemented in museums or places we normally associate with art, but also in other places in community centers and so on. Another difference between art education for social justice and socially engaged art is that teachers tend to be employees of institutions like schools, and this, I think, creates a completely different, you know, it's a different ball game to the art world, as we all know, because in schools you need to respect, you know, school policies, you need to follow certain standards, even if sometimes you might not agree completely with that. While artists tend to work in kind of less structured scenarios, they tend to be less accountable to authorities. They're not expected to work according to certain, you know, pre-established curricula or pre-established outcomes. Yeah, so educational settings tend to be more or have more constraints. Yeah. Perhaps Andrea wants to add something?
Absolutely. I think we here in Central and Eastern Europe have a very exciting perspective to add to this conversation about social engaged art and art education, because they are merging now and they are out in the streets as we speak. Now they're at this time of the week, there are teacher demonstrations being organized, some of them already active, using high-level visuals produced by art educators who, perhaps for the first time in their life as a teacher and life as a person, because they are in their 30s and 40s, find themselves at the margin of being the protagonists of outspoken, socially engaged visuals, visualizations, perhaps art, perhaps non-art. And at the same time, they have to keep their role model figure as educators, not to be vulgar, not to be unjust, not to be unaesthetic. So in the turbulent reality of Central and Eastern countries, mentioning Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, just to mention the three most turbulent of them, we practice what we preach. It is a transitional period. Soon, socially engaged art will come back to the classrooms and will be projected on the walls of the art studio and being talked about. And socially engaged art education, however, will stay with us because it has proven that it's important and it's powerful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Kevin, could we come back to you for your response to their responses to your question?
Sure. Oh, sorry.
Is it? Yes, please.
Yes, is it Andrea?
So, Kevin, you asked this first question.
Yes,
and
yes.
And Raphael and Andrea have shared their responses to that question. Would you like to come back on what they've said in terms of the similarities and differences between socially engaged art and between social justice and so between art education for social justice and socially engaged art?
Yes, briefly, obviously there's differences with who the agents, let's say, are in terms of doing socially engaged art, whether they are part of an institution. Of course, teachers and students can do socially engaged art and still be part of institutions. I'm not quite sure if it's not that I don't agree with Raphael, but I think in some ways there's a dichotomy that perhaps is too wide in terms of at least the assumption that socially engaged art by artists somehow don't have the same kind of limitations that teachers and so on have in institutions. I would just say they're different, depending on the context, of course. So I can't answer that specifically, but there are always constraints. And then I would say in the larger sense to Andrea's point, in talking about Hungary and other places, in which was also part of our study, I know that it's very difficult for some teachers to discuss certain issues, and they have to fall under certain umbrellas, terms to deal without kind of stirring up issues, around the governmental curricula or whatever the political climate might be. And that's not just with, of course, in Hungary, but every country, including the United States, especially the South. But I guess my point is that I would like to know more about this freedom, in a sense, if that's the right word to use, that Raphael is talking about, or latitude that socially engaged artists or agents making socially engaged art have compared to those that are within institutions. Because for me, being within an institution, and I'm not talking about a elementary school or high school, I have the opportunity to make change through the institution. And I'm not sure that that's, I don't want to put it on a scale, and I'm not saying you're doing that either, of like, okay, I have more latitude, I have more freedom, I have more openness to do things because I'm not under the constraints of certain limitations or responsibilities, or kind of the idea of what's sensible and not. I think that this exists for everyone, including artists as well. This is my general response, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that certainly does make sense. I mean, that you're bringing up some kind of interesting contrasts here. And I was just wondering if there are some comparable risks across Europe taken by socially engaged artists and by arts educators. And you kind of, Kevin, you kind of looked at that kind of apparent dichotomy, the differences that Raphael brought up between so arts educators may not necessarily be part of the art world, which is very different. And then, so if we do acknowledge those differences, what are the comparable risks that they're taking? But also, for example, if arts educators can't take those risks themselves, potentially they could refer to the work of socially engaged artists in their practice and draw upon them as resources. Do you think that might kind of alleviate some of the role differences as well? And you can put hands up to answer this one.
Sorry.
As a response.
I'll be quiet and let someone else respond if they would like. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Kevin that it's not simply a question of being freer. I think it's more like it's a different ball game. In education, especially, I'm thinking of schools like primary schools, secondary schools, and so on. We increasingly have a system which is dominated by learning outcomes, by standards, and teachers, whether they like it or not, are kind of have to somehow exist within that system. So whatever they produce needs to be seen, at least needs to be perceived as being part of that structure. Of course, you are right, Kevin. Even the art world has its own constraints. And our experiences, myself, I was working with Andrea Kárpáti for the last 3 years. We had, when we were working on social engaged arts project, we found that there are many constraints as well, ethical issues which come up all the time. But they're just different in nature, And for example, one of the differences is that, with some of the socially engaged arts projects we produced in the last few years were with adults. And when you're working with adults and with children, again, that's a different ballgame. Yeah, so that but I tend to agree with you that there are constraints, yeah, across the board, and you know, art is not like 100% free zone. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that's quite a round view of it in terms of the different international issues that come up and the way that risks are navigated through potentially referring to artwork, or also, Raphael, you're also mentioning the differences in educating adults to educating children, and the ways that issues have to be presented differently for children. And this is something that we find that arts educators in their training have to navigate quite quickly as they go into school teaching practice, because basically artists can make artworks about anything, and you know, they do so at their risk in some countries where it's freedom of speech is more challenging, but young people have a more limited palette, let's say, of issues that they can refer to. So that's a really good point there. Thank you very much. Right, so I mean, we could continue on this question, or if you feel like we've reached a kind of natural gathering of thought on this, we could move now to the next question, which is Raphael's question. Raphael, do you want to introduce this?
Yeah. The next question is, can you discuss concrete examples of research in which you implemented and studied projects related to issues of social inclusion, learning, and/or civic engagement among specific community members? So I'll do my best to be as brief as possible. And perhaps if I have time at the end, I'll show a few slides as well. I've been involved in different research projects over the last few years. And at the moment, I'm actually involved in an Erasmus Plus project called CARES, which is short for Critical Arts Education for Sustainable Societies, with 4 other universities. And we are studying ways of using socially engaged arts in critical pedagogy with teachers in primary and secondary schools. And we're looking at different kinds of art, like music, drama, visual art, and dance, and looking at social issues related to human rights, sustainable development, and so on. One of the interesting factors we are researching is how the kind of use of socially engaged arts in a school context helps to expand curricular horizons and encourages multidisciplinarity. However, perhaps I'd like to focus more on another project which was completed only a few months ago, and Andrea here at Kárpáti was also a member of this larger consortium, which was called AMAS. AMAS is short for Acting on the Margins, Arts as Social Sculpture. And I can give a broad outline of the project as a whole, and then I can show a few examples, or as I said, concrete examples, which I was involved in myself, or members of my team at the University of Malta were involved in. So in this AMAS, we implemented over 30 arts projects around Europe, and they studied the impact of the arts on various communities, ranging from minorities in northern Finland to Roma communities in Central Europe, sub-Saharan migrants in Malta, persons with learning disabilities, elderly women, and so on and so forth. We studied various societal challenges experienced by these groups, from problems associated with cultural exclusion to financial difficulties experienced by artists in Lapland, and the list goes on, really. Given that the fact that multiple partners were involved in AMAS, we used a range of methodologies, and I'll try to generalize as much as I can. Generally speaking, we all started by exploring the context. I think that's central to all socially engaged arts projects. You need to really explore the context thoroughly. You make contact with stakeholders, gatekeepers, become familiar with the literature on the topic and with participants' views about specific social issues. We all tended to adopt a mixed methods approach, and we integrated the evaluation of results from qualitative, arts-based, and also other forms of data collection. We used arts-based methods like drama techniques, crafts, visual arts, video editing, workshops, performance, and also other methodologies which are associated with the social sciences, like interviews, focus groups, surveys, and so on. We also, as I said, I can give a few examples of concrete examples, which I worked on in Malta. In Malta, for this project, we produced 5 creative projects in which we use theatre, public art, printmaking workshops, and a number of other things. One project which I led myself was called Suitable Citizens. I'll show a couple of images in a minute. And this was a visual art workshop with a group of sub-Saharan migrants, which led to the production of photographs, silk screen prints, stenciled images, tote bags, face masks. Actually, I'm still working with them. It is, I think that one of the nice things about this project is that to some extent it remains sustainable. But Suitable Citizens was also interesting because we decided that it was going to be documented by one of them. So we actually gave a filmmaking, kind of basic filmmaking workshop to one of our participants. He was from Eritrea and had been living in Malta for 8 years. And then he actually came to all the workshops and took videos and actually produced a film at the end about it. We had other projects like we had a play which was called All of a Sudden, which was a play with elderly women, and it was directed by a colleague of mine at the university. She's specialized in drama education. Her name is Isabel Gatt. And this was a community theatre project by older adults working, together in conjunction with theatre practitioners. We had another play which was led by a theatre director called Tony Attard. This play was called The Positive People, and this was actually our pilot project. It was interesting because it was about a topic which is still a little taboo here in Malta, unfortunately. Basically, it was about persons living with HIV. And the project led to the development of a new play which focused on this stigma. And the play was the first of its kind in the country, and interviews were carried out anonymously by social workers. And the stories emerging from these interviews then helped to develop the script. And then we had also another play which was called The Fig Tree, which was a project for persons with learning difficulties such as Down syndrome. And it was also a collaborative project which explored themes which mattered to the participants themselves. So the ideas for the script came up during kind of workshops, and we also made sure that these were themes which they would be happy to share with audiences. And they worked with professional actors, so it was kind of bringing professional actors together with non-professionals, while researchers assessed the impact of the involvement of the participants in these activities. And the fifth project, before I go to the images, was a kind of it was an interesting and also humorous project to some extent. Its name was Batman from Gżira. Gżira is a town here in Malta, and which unfortunately this small town has become completely overdeveloped by contractors. So public land virtually does not exist because every inch of public land is taken over and becomes private. So this artist who developed this project, her name is Christina Borch, and she's a socially engaged artist. And she thought, oh, this could be actually the next Gotham City, and we need a Batman who would come along to save this city. And so we had a number of elderly people, actually interesting. We had fishermen, for example, who actually met on a number of occasions and then developed mini guerrilla actions, which were like posters and postcards sent to members of parliament. And the posters were placed on big construction sites. And at the end, we also had a public performance. I can share some slides just to help everyone kind of visualize what I'm talking about. Yeah. Can you see it? Yeah. Can you see the slides? Yeah, I'm taking that. So yes. So this is Suitable Citizens, and this, as I said, this was a project with a group of sub-Saharan migrants. It started off with photography, as you can see on the right-hand side, and then they developed the photographs into silk screens. Here they're starting to produce prints on paper, and then eventually they produce those prints or other images which they were photographing on tote bags and also face masks and also scarves. And finally, we ended with a kind of collective, very large kind of fabric piece. And this is something which I've continued doing with this group of migrants in the last couple of years. Then we had another project as I said, which was called All of a Sudden. This is, well, Fakatain is the title in Maltese. This was actually a group of elderly women, all of whom had lost their partners. And so they decided to create a play about getting old. And whether it's a tragedy or not. And it was interesting to see that in the script, they decided to basically state that, no, it's not such a bad thing. It's just a cycle of life. And I wouldn't go back if I could. And this was also, unfortunately, it was all created during COVID. So there were certain restrictions. Coming back to what Kevin was saying before, there are constraints even in the art world, and COVID was one mega constraint. So in the beginning, we could only do this for a very restricted audience, but then we decided to film it. And so we took the film then to a number of different retirement homes. And it was very inspiring to see how different elderly people in these retiree homes reacted and then spoke about this play amongst themselves. This was another play which we produced as part of this big EU-funded project. It was called Inclusivity, which, as I said earlier, means the positive people. And the title basically came from the participants themselves, who are, they're persons living with HIV. And the first thing they told our interviewers was, we don't want to project a kind of a very negative, image, very pessimistic image that, those of us who are living with HIV are, nearing their death, and everything's black and bleak. So they wanted this kind of very bright image. It was a bit shocking for us in the beginning, kind of, okay, you sure about this? Like, you want us to? And yeah. So we decided to go for it. We had a rehearsed reading in the beginning. It was on Zoom, which, as everyone knows, became the place to be during COVID. And the participants who had actually given us their interviews were also present on the day. They were not visible, their names weren't visible, but they could give us reactions afterwards, and they did. And our scriptwriter actually decided to rewrite parts of the script as a result of the feedback which we got from the interviewees. And this was actually a play which, towards the end of COVID, when things started to become looser and we could have plays in small theaters for small audiences, this was actually the play which was set up in a theater in Valletta. This was a play which was developed by Tony Attard, and this is called the Sidratatin, which means the fig tree, and it basically was about this kind of tree of wishing tree, and all these participants could hang their wishes on this tree. And this is also another scene from the same play. And this is the Batman project. This is actually Christina Borch, the artist herself, who used to meet these persons from Gżira. Gżira is the town which I mentioned a few minutes ago. And she used to meet them in a kind of community center in Gżira itself. I think it's really important when you're doing socially engaged arts projects that you take that extra step to kind of make things as comfortable as possible for the participants by actually going there. So she would meet them around the table, as you can see over here. And some of them actually, these were fishermen. So, well, they were fishermen in their younger days. So they were basically sharing their stories about what this town looked like in the past, and what has changed over the years. So that is, those are my slides, and that's my presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic, Raphael. What brilliant projects. I mean, all of them you could kind of spend a lot longer on, and there, so many issues of inclusivity that are brought into those concrete projects that you're talking about. And so, to discuss that question, could the other panel members please come in and discuss some examples of, so Raphael's question was, can you discuss concrete examples of research in which you implemented and studied projects related to issues of social inclusion, learning and/or civic engagement among specific community members? So who would like to start? You can do hands up if you like, or I can choose somebody. Thank you, Andrea.
I'm starting because I was part of the same project. And when we started out, we decided not to pretend that there has never been anything done in terms of happily playing art studio work with poor children, getting them in there, feeding them, making them happy through art, then sending them back to their miserable lives with the good conscience that we did a great job. So we had this feeling that there had been lots of work done in the field for social engaged art education, but they may not be just the same thing that Amos wanted to do. That's why we did a systematic literature review that is published. Sophie Lindström from the University of Borås in Sweden was the head researcher for this part of the project. 10,600 papers were identified, all of which claimed in their abstracts and their titles that they were doing good through art. And of course, I won't go into detail. It's a profound study, as is lit review, a normal one. I only mentioned two things. Most of the projects, but really more than 80%, were not traceable. They were dead and gone once the money was out, so they did not prove sustainable. We wanted, however, to be there, even after everything, the money bag is emptied, and we are gone back to our nice universities. So we wanted to create something sustainable because that is exactly what was not done before. Second, these projects were not evaluated properly, as you should evaluate an art education project qualitatively, of course, if you think that's the only way. But sometimes when you say you want to develop skills, it's not that bad to be quantitative, a little bit at least. So we were searching eagerly for studies that did not end with an empathic declaration of the promoters of the project that we did very well, but said this was done before. This is where we started with the kids and that, or adults or whoever, and this is where we ended. So assessment was the second thing that the Amos project wanted to do profoundly, and actually Malta University was taking the lead in this effort, and Corvinus, my university, also produced a collection of art education assessment instruments to facilitate this procedure. So we wanted to be sustainable and accountable. We wanted to be able to tell you, when you do this, that is what's gonna happen, most probably. Of course, you have to contextualize everything, and this will be our third team that I'm going to present for you later. So it's Kevin's turn.
Yeah, sure. I haven't been involved in these large funded projects that Andrea and Raphael have involved with. I've been more working in the institutions teaching pre-service teachers or graduate students and PhD students who do their own, some of them do their own artwork in particular. And I think that one of the things that I'm very interested in is, so I taught a group of pre-service graduate teachers at Georgia State just last semester, and they're all very much involved in what's going on in Atlanta right now with this building of this, what's called Cop City. So it's actually like a gigantic police state within the state. And so I guess what I wanted to say about that is that there's a difficult time, I think, for some of the students to relate their own idea of protest and action and reaction to what's going on in the world, in their world, and in particular their local community, to art education. So, you know, somehow, as Raphael, I think, pointed to, there's like this difference, right? And oftentimes it was like the question comes up, well, I want to write about this, but that's not art education. So in some ways, I think this is trailing off a little bit, but I think it's very important to really expand the scope of what art education is. And then to respond to Andrea's point, I think, I mean, I can't tell you how many, probably in the same way that all of us have reviewed articles and essays in which things seem so seamless, as Andrea pointed out, right? So I did this wonderful project and everything was seamless and there was no stumbling blocks, no problems. I think this is a big problem. And I think that what you say, Andrea, is totally important, is not only what are some of the problems and issues, but also what does assessment do? What forms of assessment do to the actual project? Because obviously it's like observer watching participants, it changes the entire context. So again, I'm not speaking to my own project, but these are questions about what you have talked about. And then thirdly, and I guess this is just a really broad question, so you'll have to pardon me that I'm answering your question with questions. So when is art not socially engaged art? Of course, we can answer that question. Okay, people make art in their studio and people put art up in like MoMA, and we can answer it quite easily. But I would really like to know, like, what from our esteemed colleagues, my esteemed colleagues, what, how do you draw the line? I love your examples, so I mean, I'm not questioning that, but like, so what is not socially engaged art? How can one not be socially engaged? I understand we want to improve things. We have specific issues, local issues around immigration, around oppression of all sorts. But if we don't deal with that, is that not socially engaged? This is my broader question to either one of you or both of you.
Yeah, can I take this, Miranda? Yeah, I mean, of course, sometimes I think it's not a question of creating boxes and saying this is socially engaged and that isn't socially engaged. But obviously there is a kind of spectrum, and that spectrum very often relates to the amount of participation that involves the collaboration of others. And for us working in a mass, this is the kind of working definition that we took. For us, it was, if we're going to create a project, then the project has to involve members of a particular community. Of course, then, you can stretch the meaning to also include works like Guernica by Picasso, because it is also about, it's socially engaged in the sense that it kind of makes an anti-war comment and so on. And, and I agree with what both of you were saying before about, the whole question of, failed projects to some extent, or perhaps, emphasizing the successful aspects of the project as though, it was also kind of rosy and so on. What we tried to do in a mass was that, in order to kind of minimize the possibility that kind of not all voices would be heard, we try to involve as many different persons as possible. Of course, it's not perfect, but we involved participants, we involved, from communities, we involved gatekeepers, we involved researchers, and the researchers came from different fields themselves. And we involved artists, and we spoke to other artists and policymakers as well, especially people involved in cultural policy. Something which I stressed from the beginning of this project was that we needed to involve NGOs, and some of the partners did. For example, in Malta, we had an NGO with each one of the projects, which I showed you in the slides. So we had NGOs like refugee NGOs, environmental advocacy groups, LGBTQI+ NGOs. And their help was really, really crucial to the success of the project. But then this brings me to the other question, like who decides what is success and who decides what is failure? And sometimes you might have something which, I don't know, from a researcher's perspective might be seen as a bit of a failure. And yet from the participant's perspective, it could be something else, or vice versa. Yeah. I don't know if Andrea or Miranda want to add anything, but thank you for your comments.
Just a sentence to add. Thank you very much for your comments, Tavin. Kevin. Assessment should be sensitive and sensible. For my students, I often use the metaphor of the butterfly. If you want to study a butterfly, you shouldn't kill it. You shouldn't just grab its wings and then no more flying for the butterfly. However, you shouldn't make art education a mysterious, undescribable, heavenly thing, because then policymakers cross you out of the curriculum, as they very often do. So you have to find the middle way. And of course, we did it because in the AMAS project, we were very concerned with being sustainable. As I said, we wanted to create solid programs that teachers understand and feel that they are valid, they are good, they are okay to try. This is what I wanted to say.
I think there's some really amazing points being made. I really like that analogy you made there about art education not being a butterfly pinned so that you can examine what it is, but then but particularly in relation to this question about what is concrete, because of course something that is real doesn't have to be heavy and kind of totally tangible and pinioned and kind of transparent, does it also? I mean, that point you're making around what is concrete, and what you seem to be saying is actually a lot of projects are presenting themselves as concrete because they're saying everything is great and trying to kind of iron out any chinks that might be seen as weaknesses and therefore not concrete. Whereas what the alternative view of this would be actually to see the pros and cons, the ways that methodologies had to change, the way that decisions had to change, or adaptations had to happen, or things that you intended to do didn't quite happen, so that maybe kind of reconceived and adapted the next time, that becomes the validity or the transferability of what might be seen as a concrete project.
May I say just really, I'm sorry to ask these questions, but they're rhetorical, so we don't have to respond. But I was very curious when Raphael was talking about the work that was done during COVID and showed the screen with everyone's face on it with Zoom and so on. So this is, again, you don't have to respond about, but just thinking about this because I've been writing about it. So can socially engaged art be completely online? Is that a social space as the same way? Because it seems it's not a critique, but so much of socially engaged art is thinking about a particular type of society or community in which is outside of the virtual. And this is just a question that maybe we come back to later, but can there be many socially engaged projects that the social is actually within the digital? So there is no concrete, so to speak, bodies and so on. And I just think it's a really interesting question in thinking about the post-digital and post-COVID world. Sorry, we don't need to talk about it. I just wanted to bring that up.
No, but I'd like to answer that really quickly, Kevin. I think that's a really valid question. And obviously that question came to our minds so many times because when we started AMAS, there was no COVID. And then like 2 months in, and COVID just exploded everywhere. And all of a sudden, we had this enormous upheaval in our lives because we said, okay, we've been talking about socially engaged art. And as you said yourself, like we were only thinking in physical terms. And it seemed to be the most, I'll be honest with you, it seemed to be the most authentic form of engagement, like meeting people, especially because we were dealing with groups, not all of whom would have actually access to the digital realm. So we needed to take that into account as well. But we did actually have some projects in AMAS which were completely digital. Like, for example, our colleagues at Charles University in Prague, they decided because they had quite difficult restrictions during the lockdown, they decided to have a project about museums within people's homes where children would work with their parents, with their grannies as well, and develop a mini museum of glass artifacts. Prague is very famous for its glass. So each family then created a mini museum. So they all became like curators, and they could show those mini museums to each other only virtually on Zoom or whatever other platform they were using. Yeah.
These are wonderful examples. They're really wonderful examples. I mean, the Centre for Arts and Learning had a whole year during the COVID year around that time of events on affective digital presence, looking at how we could bring presence to online learning experiences. And that included a lot of kind of tussles around materiality and how this could be even related to in online spaces. So yeah, it's a really good and still a vibrant question, I think, in terms of the way that people are, as we are now, trying to pursue an international discussion with an audience that's going across many nations, but kind of retaining a sort of concreteness and materiality to our discussion. And similarly, artists are trying to do this internationally also. So yeah, we need to keep this in mind. And I'd like to bring in Andrea's question now. Andrea, would you like to ask your question? Andrea, you're on mute.
Unmute myself. Well, it was whose art, whose culture, and it was about colonialism through art education and just pushing your own cultural ideas and ideals down the throat of disadvantaged groups, even cultural minorities, and not giving them a chance to articulate their own needs and actually make their voice heard. I want to illustrate this notion through a few slides. If I can easily share, then I will show you. So share screen, here we go. And I hope you see this. Do you? Yes, you do. Lovely. Then let me just go to the very beginning. All right. So what we wanted to do with AMAS, we wanted to develop creative individuals, resilience. When you are very poor, you need that. Self-assurance, when you are constantly subdued, you need the self-assertion skill. And we wanted to develop sustainable creativity and all the skills for that. And I want to show this in order to illustrate that we were not just talking to art teachers. Actually, most of the times we are trying to talk to policymakers, because art teachers seem to agree that art is good for you and you can do a lot for promoting equality and making disadvantaged minorities find that not just their voice, their image, their imagery. So here are some publications of the white paper, the roadmap booklet, and the arts-based, the book that arts-based, oh, I don't see my own title, Arts-Based Interventions and Social Change in Europe. That's the book where 24 AMAS projects will be described in detail. And Routledge hopefully will also produce a well-illustrated book that you will see how we visualize disadvantaged minorities and how we help them find their voice. Now, I'm showing you this slide in order to illustrate whose art and whose culture. Two of the Hungarian projects actually tackled museum education. The two museums were situated on the margin of a Roma ghetto or a simple poor settlement. The Ludwig Museum was actually at the verge of the biggest Budapest ghetto for Roma people. They never even thought about going to nice big Ludwig Museum, but should they? So once we finished this wonderful project, the children marched into Ludwig, had a good time. We started thinking, how many artworks of Roma minority did they find in the Ludwig Museum of Contemporary Art, Budapest? I tell you, 4. There are about 1,000 artworks. 4 of them are Roma. In terms of the Hungarian population, 9.6 million, 10% is Roma, and many, many distinguished artists. So here, just dwelling in the museums, we thought about what if it's not what they want. Okay, we looked at social media because we were training cultural influencers. I won't get into it. The main thing is that they were, and they are, posting on the Roma or Gypsy culture, however you want to put it, they say Gypsy, in an authentic and enjoyable way for young people. And fortunately, after 2 years of training, they have hundreds and hundreds of thousands followers, and they produce good quality content about Roma culture. But before we did that, we looked at the big wide world. What is there? Gypsy. A dog breed is called Gypsy, lots of posts. A horse breed is called Gypsy, lots of posts, and so is the Jeep. But basically, what is being posted is about the Beás population, the Hungarian Beás, and also everywhere else. They are the wanderers, the travelers. They have a fascinating culture, but they are the ones who are targeted with all the negative stereotypes you can imagine, but not posting about the Ola, the Romongro, who are just like everybody else. Poor or rich, their kids go to school, they are articulate, speak nice Hungarian, polished Hungarian, no problem with them. And they are equally numbered in the Roma population in Hungary. So in social media, you will find Beás people presented. And the Roma cultural influencer training wanted to show you their culture, their art, their educational potentials, their women as role models, because they are quite a lot of powerful women. Of course, when you started searching on Hungarian and worldwide pages, we found that there is a lot of bad wording. Gypsy is a slur and the like. We found that imagery is highly superfluous, focusing on the beauties of garments and some jewelry for sale, not the culture. And we found that on the Hungarian TikTok, highly popular among the Hungarian young Roma and the Hungarian young white Hungarians, or how should I put it? So the rest, we are Gypsies. Identity issues are barely tackled, but Gypsy music and Gypsy whatever lifestyle is being tackled very much. And you see arrogance and aggression, rising stars and celebs, scandals, and frustration with life. This is what Roma social media is like. This is a very nice Instagram study, one of the visuals of that. Here again, systematic study of the social media sites were executed in Hungary. Majom means monkey. So C is the first word of Gypsy in Hungarian, cigány. So cigány majom, Gypsy monkey, says one of the Instagram photos, quite characteristic, and here is an aggressive one. And of course, you have the positive Roma pages, and these are the happy, kitschy pages, just music and dance. That's what your life is all about, right? Here is the most famous celeb singers, Notar Mary, and nothing bad with that. It's good to sing and dance. It's lovely to hear Gypsy music in restaurants. Of course, it's far from authentic Gypsy songs, but who cares? So it's not bad. However, last slide, in the Roma cultural influencer training, we wanted to show the Roma, these are the girls we selected. We wanted to show the Roma cultural heritage, knowledge, attitudes, legal and psychological implications were taught to the girls. There was a constant psychological support and mentoring. We had journalist mentors, we had psychologist mentors. We wanted them to identify their own art, their own culture, to be able to answer the question, whose art, whose culture? It's ours. We have identified it. We have detected it, revealed it, and now we are posting about it. And of course, being an influencer is a catchy word. We had a lot of applicants and 21 women were trained. So I will stop sharing now. After showing these few images, I hope I actually stopped sharing. Did I? I wonder. Yep, I'm here again, and I hope I can stop sharing. My God, I cannot stop. Okay, did I stop sharing or not?
No,
No,
sharing.
okay. Looking for whatever, righty. I'm closing whatever I have. And then I will probably be able, new share. Okay, no, stop sharing. My God. Okay. I want to stop sharing and I can't.
Oh, yeah.
It's a shame.
Okay.
No, I succeeded.
I've just enabled
Okay,
you to do it.
Summing it up. If you want to, just remember Margaret Mead and all the classics. At one of my courses, I teach cultural anthropology through visualizations, the visual language of cultural anthropology. And there we have Margaret Mead. And there we have the French guys on the images. Margaret actually went into the village and lived there, and then went to the other village and tried not to die there. And in terms of the other guys, the French researchers, you can see them sitting on the bench. Everybody is in normal clothing. They are in white, as if dressed for tennis. So I think in order to actually promote art education through for disadvantaged minorities, you have to get to know them. And we in Hungary think that it is themselves who can get to know their own culture the best and be authentic representatives. So also in art education, we were looking for Roma art teachers, and we found a very few, and we hope to train more. Thank you. So this was whose arts, whose culture.
Thank you, Andrea. A really fascinating discussion of Roma inclusion and the issues around that. And Kevin or Raphael, would you like to respond to Andrea's question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously aware of the work which Andrea, the great work which she has been doing, you know, with her Roma Influencer project, for example, and this whole research on gypsies. And I'd just like to say that, you know, what she said about the Ludwig Museum and the fact that I think there were only 4 works which relate to this ethnicity. It is somewhat tragic that museums are still not representative of the different ethnicities in society. And unfortunately, this you know, is comparable sometimes to what happens in curricula, which also might not be you know, representative of different groups, different social groups. It could also be representative of, you know, what happens in classrooms, which sometimes still tend to be discriminatory. You know, recently we had a situation here in Malta, only a few days ago actually, where this activist said, you know, like, you know, in Maltese classrooms, we still have the crucifix as a symbol of Christianity, and perhaps it's about time that we also have symbols of other faiths. And this activist is a Muslim himself, and the onslaught of comments, you know, barrage of comments online and on the social media was incredible. And it was incredible, you know, negative comments, because it was kind of felt that, you know, it's almost like he's saying he wants to exclude the crucifix from the classroom. And in his view was more like, you know, I'm thinking of inclusion as broadening the curriculum. It's not about closing off. It's not about making it narrower. It's not about deleting any aspect of culture, but of understanding that, culture is actually quite complex and varied. And, the classroom or the museum, just to come back to Andrea's example, needs to reflect that variety and that richness. Yeah, so thank you, Andrea, for bringing up these examples. They were very interesting.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Andrea. It's very important, and I agree with Raphael, of course. And I think your question on the surface seems simple in terms of words, but it is so incredibly complex in terms of a question. There's so many things I can say. I mean, first of all, what's going on in the United States right now, especially in the South, where there's this talk of woke culture, where it's actually illegal in the state of Georgia to talk about critical race theory. And in Florida, they're banning books. I don't need to get it all into that. So it's like, I don't know what century I'm in right now. But I will say also that on the other side of that, I have a question about representation, because I think we should question the very notion of representation in culture. And that does not mean in any way to disclude or exclude the things that we've been talking about. But I think too often there has been implicit or kind of ways of discussing culture which doesn't take into consideration the idea of culture and cultural engagement, whether it's antagonistic or affiliation or affiliative, being produced performatively, and that it's always becoming. And so I have a concern teaching, having taught classes with very different individuals in the class and coming from different places, and speaking of culture as being, and I know you're not saying this, so again, I want to be very clear, but I think art education has a duty to question the very notion of representation and how one can discuss and represent culture without understanding these, competing claims of communities, exchange of values and meanings, and becoming and going beyond kind of traditional ways that we have signified culture. This is, again, not to, I agree with everything you're saying, and I think it's really important to be more inclusive in whatever way that we can be. But it's also, I think, important to think about the ways that we reproduce the very notion of representation, and how we represent culture, or that even by trying to be inclusive, we may be actually doing we might be reproducing ways of representation that are not commensurable with ways that the contemporary world is really dealing with the entanglement of who we are at any point and our subjectivities. So again, I think maybe I've gone astray from what your question is, but I agree that we need to be more inclusive. We need to be institutions, schools, but it's also a question of community. So what does a community consist of when we know that there are antagonisms within communities, many? So how do we as art educators, again, I'm answering question with a question, deal with these issues of representation and antagonism, and always going beyond some kind of concretized notion of culture? So you don't have to answer any of those questions, but
these research questions are arriving at kind of even more interesting questions, and that's what often happens with research, doesn't it? So I feel that we're kind of working through the issues in the process of discussing them. We've now got to the point where our members of the audience could ask questions for the panel, or could come back on issues that have been raised. So I've got a question here from Yanis. Yanis, would you like to come on camera and ask your question?
Hello. I just put my question in the chat. I don't know if everybody can see it. So
yeah, so people won't be able to see it.
Okay. Okay. Basically, I have a key question which is related to the museums, which is the focus of my research. And I would like to hear from the panel. What are the constraints of trying to make change through an institution, particularly when this institution is a museum? I will be very interested to know specifically what are the challenges, because here you continuously I hear you engage with subordinated groups or communities. And actually, because my research is related to how you can engage subordinated groups of young people with museums. This is the key question of my research. And I'm at the final stages, but it's a different story. But for me, the key question I have in my research is, how do we navigate the issues of power and culture in involving subordinated groups with museums, which is actually represented, is a dominant form of culture?
Thanks, Yanis. Would one of our panel like to respond to Yanis's question? Andrea.
Yeah, there has to be a field study to find out about life themes, motives that contemporary artists find important and filter through their styles and artistic intentions, and then the work arrives at the museum. And the disadvantaged community may not be discussing it, of course, but experiencing it. So the project in the Ludwig Museum, led by Zsófia Somogyi-Rohonci, art historian and cultural communicator, so a media person, also was entitled "It's Your Life." So Yanis, once we could convince the kids that it's their life that's hanging there on the walls of this fancy museum. There are issues, of course, not narratives always, but also just beauty, colors, shapes, and forms and compositions, materials that they can associate with, photographs that resemble visions and versions of their reality. It's your life. Every lesson had to be focusing on a thematic area that could be associated with life. And there is one more thing I want to emphasize. Teachers have to be trained. There was a 4-month online and face-to-face teacher education, in-service education course, voluntary. Of course, for teachers who were interested, because they were teaching kids from the slums, from the ghettos, or from a small village where everybody is just very poor. And these teachers were fed up with being forced into the curriculum that is for middle-aged kids in middle-aged art studios. So once the teachers realized there was another way, and they could refashion the same objectives that in the curriculum are illustrated by this artist, and you could illustrate it by that one, another one. Then the teachers became so creative. So now we have a thick booklet full of teachers' projects who went back to the schools and just kept teaching. That's it.
Thank you, Andrea. That's a really wonderful response. I really like that idea of their life is on the walls of the museums. It brings that vitality of actually relevance, doesn't it, to those interpretations. We have a question from Dennis Atkinson. Dennis, would you like to come on camera and ask your question? Dennis, you there? Hi, Dennis.
All right. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I mean, thanks all of you for your presentations. I really enjoyed this last hour and a half, so thank you very much. There are lots of things I want to talk about, but I've only got a few minutes. So one of the things that came to my mind was, can we think about the idea of socially disengaged practices? Practices without criteria? Can we use the notion of cosmos, which is from Stenger's, which is the unknown constituted by multiple divergent worlds and the articulations of what they may be possible, of what can be possible, what may be possible from them? If we take that on board, this points to the question of an infinity to art education, as well as to an infinity of art. And for me, the idea of cosmopedagogies based upon this notion of cosmos comes to mind. Those were just some thoughts I had about that particular idea.
Right, so a practice without criteria, disengaged from social kind of urgency. What do people think about that?
I love it. I never thought about socially disengaged practice. This is really interesting, Dennis, on the idea of cosmos.
It's not to disengage from the social. That's
yeah. I know what you mean.
Trying to find a form of words. It's to go into the outside, as it were. Not Lyotard talks about the pagan as being to do with something which exists outside, beyond boundaries, beyond rules, beyond regulations, and working from there. Sorry.
No, that's very interesting, and even this reference to Lyotard's notion of the pagan. I think essentially what you are saying, if I may kind of simplify it, is that in a sense we need to avoid predictability, and this is I guess what all interesting art that tries to do. Whether it does it or not is something else. And I think this is also what every decent art educator should try to do. Again, whether the art educators manage to do that within the constraints of institutions or not is a different matter. But very often we end up with, for example, socially engaged arts projects which tend to be predictable in the sense that they follow a recipe. And unfortunately, this is also one of the disadvantages of working within the constraints of a new funded project, where you have to give results, and you have to give results within a kind of set of deliverables that you've already agreed, you've promised to do, with the European Commission. So, sometimes because of that, then you can end up working on projects which to some extent are predictable. But also when Kevin mentioned earlier this idea of antagonism, I think it was Kevin who mentioned this, and I think that's a really important point to make, because that can actually bring in an element of unpredictability in projects. When you don't set out to work with a community to come to this sort of kind of like happy sort of we're all meeting together, we're all happy, we're all it's just, and you kind of assess the success of the project on the basis of everyone being happy, this is a tendency, and it's a little bit unavoidable as well, because when you're working especially with marginalized groups, the last thing you want to see is them being unhappy, perhaps, if you know what I mean. So the caring part of you kind of tends to think about these kind of projects. I need to really bring them in, make them feel included, make them feel at home, bring them food and drink during the workshops to make everyone feel really at home.
I don't think art can save the world, but I do think art practices can open up new worlds, new cosmicities, and that's a risky business, and we have to take risk into account.
Yeah, I agree. But as you know, I think I'd mentioned this. I discussed this with you once a while ago. I was thinking about this notion of risk when I was working with this group of sub-Saharan migrants on suitable citizens, and I was faced by persons who had risked their lives literally by crossing the sea. Some of them saw their friends dying in front of their own eyes, and that's real risk. The kind of risk which artists get involved with in comparison is mild. So I felt, when I was talking about risk, and then I hear their stories, it kind of makes you go silent. You know what I mean? because it's a completely different level of risk. And so to some extent, I felt when I was working on this particular project, when I asked myself this question, and I'm not quite sure how I answered it, like, do I actually have a right to place them in a situation of further, like, antagonism and risk when I know that, what they've been through? Yeah, it's never easy. No one is saying that, socially engaged arts or art education for social justice is going to be 100%, correct in all the things it does. But I don't know, from my experience, I always came to the conclusion at the end that it's worth trying, even though ahead that it's not going to be 100% successful by your own criteria or probably by the criteria of others. Yeah.
Thanks.
Right, thank you very much, Raphael and Dennis, for that interesting discussion. I've got a question. It might sound quite basic, but it's to do with the inclusivity in our education internationally. In the UK, our policy has kind of designed out a lot of participation of young people in our education, and it's made art education kind of more steered towards people who are in independent education in a way, because of the kind of various policies that are in place. And I wondered if you are experiencing something similar internationally.
Well, maybe I can respond to that, if that's fine. Having been in Finland for over 10 years and seen a dramatic change from what was at least understood as a very different type of art school and art making, and the very idea of artistic research, arts-based research really wasn't quite discussed here at all at that point. Now, the entrepreneur is the kind of umbrella term in which this university in which I work at is really based. I think, of course, it's not uncommon in most neoliberal or exceedingly neoliberal institutions. But for Finland, I think it's a bit different because, I've seen it decades ago in the United States. And so I guess if I'm kind of interpreting your question, or I'm interpreting it a certain way, it's very much about making sure that whoever comes into our program or enters the program is somehow, as Raphael kind of pointed to earlier, there's protocol, assessment, criteria, you name it, which defines the very kind of track in which this person comes in and is going to be an entrepreneur, right? And the education itself is for that sort of, whether or not this is about whatever type of socially engaged art or not, or disengaged art, it's still more towards making sure that it's the economy that is the kind of, the capitalism, of course, is the kind of underlying feature of the education that was not in earlier iterations of what I saw and was part of in this institution. This is unfortunate for me. And basically we're splitting, for example, just really quickly, this institution is becoming much, much more of an institution that is about creating entrepreneurs, creating upstarts, and so on. And then there's the Arts Academy. So the state decides, here's an art academy where you can kind of do your work and get an MFA, do whatever. And then there's this institution in which I work, which is becoming more and more about a certain type of notion of art and artist. I don't know if that is really addressing your question or not, but it's deeply troubling, of course, as many things are. But this is like, I can feel it on my body. It's like, inscribed on me as an educator.
So it's that feeling of art has to be commercialized in order to be included within education at any level. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, commercialized even, but about social impact. So it doesn't, so commercialized, yes, but they're not, but also I think the term here is what is the social impact of your art? But what they mean by social impact is not what we just heard in this panel, right? That, you know, it has to be measurable, right? It has to somehow help Finnish economy. It has to somehow have an impact that one can actually fit within a standardized kind of template. And the impact that was made, well, I would say the different type of impact that was came, I don't even say before, because I don't want to use that term, but that I experienced or understood in a different sense of time was very different. And now, you know, we have a hard time explaining or getting through what that impact is, because the impact, like socially engaged art in a way, is already kind of predefined. And so, you know, how do we have to, within it, and this goes to the other question about how do you like work within the institution to change the institution? Well, you have to change the very definition of impact. You have to work to change it and change minds. And that's very difficult when you work with a school of, you know, that has 3 engineering schools, 1 science school, 1 business school, and you're the only art school. So yeah, that's a long answer to your question. So I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. I'm just looking, we've got just a couple of minutes left. So Andrea or Raphael, would you like to come back on that one for a couple of minutes before I?
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with what Kevin has just been saying, because it's something which I've been experiencing recently myself as well, and not only within the university, but also within other kind of cultural scenarios like arts councils and so on. There is this kind of emphasis on this entrepreneurial discourse, which tends to be, you know, about being competitive, about being flexible, thinking of education as a commodity, thinking of education and art only in terms of, you know, exchange value. So it's not about the common good. It's not about a humanistic discourse. It's not about respect or tolerance or sensitivity towards cultures, but it's more about, okay, you need to get this done, and which is the best way to do it. And everything is kind of translated into measurable terms, as Kevin was saying. And it's, yeah, it feels tragic in a way that sometimes universities are kind of falling into this sort of this discourse. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose we're working with that tragedy to make it a livable kind of a livable journey of hope and still for our students, aren't we? So yeah. Pardon, Dennis? Oh, yeah. So yeah. So we've covered some really serious topics here, and there's still obviously much more room for discussion. And thanks to everybody who's been in our audience today, and for people who asked questions of our panel. This recording will be on the Cal Events page, and along with our other recordings. We hope to connect with our eminent professors in this discussion again, and maybe even visit you in Malta and Finland and Helsinki. So that would be, sorry, Budapest. So that would be amazing. We could go to Helsinki as well, potentially. But yeah, so there's a whole kind of range of interesting places that we could literally go with this discussion, and many other great potentials that we could bring to our discussion of what it means to be all for the arts. And to some extent, it sounds a bit like a lobbying perspective. And in a way, it is through research, though, as Andrea has brought to attention and others have brought to attention here, that it's not all just about showing what's good about our projects, but showing the difficulties as well. So in terms of finding out how we can ask even better questions, as Kevin has been doing too, and then raising some amazing breadths of what it means to be inclusive, as well as Raphael has done. So yeah, thanks everybody for being in our audience today. And you may want to listen to this recording again. I know I do. And we hope to see you again soon at our next CAL event.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Bye, and
Fantastic.
thank you for this
Bye.
interesting discussion.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Have a great week. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you.